Hello and welcome to a chess tutorial for absolute beginners. My name is Ebrahim Ahmed and I'll be your chess guide today for this video. Let's start. We're going to be covering very beginner stuff like how the pieces move, their value, and the King's Indian opening. We won't go too much into theory, so there's no need to worry. Nothing hard will be covered here. So this is the chessboard. As you can see, you have white and black side. If you're wondering what these letters and numbers are, these kind of label the squares, kind of like a coordinate plane that you learn in math. So if I say E4, you go look at this E, and then you go up to this 4. So this is the E4 square. And that's kind of basic knowing of your squares. You don't have to memorize them, but it's nice to memorize them. It also helps you with if you're playing against bots. Bots typically use the square names. So each square has its own name, like A8, A7, A6, etc. We're now gonna look at how the pieces move. So you have the pawn, which is the least valuable piece you have. The pawn can move 2 squares ahead on its first move, and once after its first move, it can move 1 square, but it doesn't have to move 1 square at its first 2 squares at its first move. It can also move 1 square. Think about the pawn. It can only capture things diagonally. So if there was a piece in front of a pawn, it wouldn't be able to take it, but it'd only be able to take it if it was diagonal. The knight can only move in an L shape, either vertically or horizontally. Cool thing about the knight is it can jump over pieces, which makes it a good piece to start with. Which makes it a good piece to start with because it can jump over the pawn line. Next is the bishop. You have a black square or white square bishop, and that's because if you have a white square bishop, you can only move in the white squares because bishops can only move diagonally. They can move diagonally all the way through. So if there's no piece in between the two endpoints, it can go all the way through, like all the way to the other side. Same goes for the black square bishop. When it comes to the value of bishop and horses, they're both the same value when you're counting the pieces. But depending on the game, you'd want to hold on to a bishop or a horse. So if you're playing on trading, a nice tip would be horses are better in cramped games where all the pieces are close. Like, a dry game, you'd want to have a horse more closed in game. While in open games, you'd want to hold on to the bishop. So there's something to put in mind before you trade any of these two pieces. But they're both the same value when it comes to counting. Next you have the rook. It's more valuable than the bishops and knights. Sorry if I called a knight a horse. It's more valuable than bishops and knights. The rook moves diagonally and horizontally. It's one of the easier pieces to know where it will go. Thing about rooks, you want to keep them in my opinion, until the end game or end of the mid game. We're gonna explain what mid game and end game is later, but you want to hold on to this piece till the end of the game, basically, because if you pull out at the beginning, you might lose it. So you got to be careful with it. This is your strongest piece and second most valuable piece on the board. If used correctly, can be the most dangerous piece on the board. This is your queen. The queen can move like a rook and like a bishop. It can go all the way diagonally and all the way horizontally and vertically. So definitely a piece you want to hold on to. Thing about queens, they're these pieces that you want to hold on to till the end, but at the same time you kind of want to activate them also early. So you gotta time it right. Depending on the game, it'll change, but most of the time you'll end up holding on to them till the end game, or until your enemy pulls out their queen and starts threatening moving it around. By that time, you also want to bring out your queen to have a balance in the middle. Next is the king. The king is your most valuable piece because, it's the king, the monarch. And since it's the king, it's the it's the piece that you want to protect the most because it's with this piece that checkmates happen. So it's the piece that decides if you win or lose. Um, People typically underestimate kings and pawns. I personally, when I started chess, I underestimated kings and pawns. They were like invisible to me. Like a king couldn't do anything, in my opinion, back when I just started. But I think strategically speaking, a king is best for protection rather than offensive. It's more a protection piece. So you can have pieces surrounding it like rooks or queens, and and your opponent probably wouldn't want to take them because it's protected by a king. Unless they have a piece protecting a square at the same time, then it's a different story. But they're more they kings. You'll have to not use a king, especially in the end game when you only have limited pieces and you want to protect them all. You keep them around the king. Phases. So the first phase when it comes to chess is the opening phase. This is the phase where you develop your pieces. If you look at the green board, not a lot is happening, but you also have to be careful in the opening phase. The opening phase, you can also get checkmated in 3 moves. It happens. You'd be surprised how many times it can happen to you while you play chess. For example, if here in the blue board, if black moves his queen to h4, which is here, there's a green line. It would be a checkmate because the king has nowhere to go and he's checked. And why? And it's called the opening phase because you have to do openings. Openings, there are a bunch of them. There's like King's Indian. There's Berlin Defense. But there's Queen's Gambit, like the show. Bunch of openings. Depending on who you are, the opening can be more aggressive, more defensive. Typically with the black, you want to go with a more defensive position rather than offensive position. But this completely depends on you. I just do that because black goes second and white goes first. Then the mid game happens. It's this phase when you start trading pieces. For example, you start trading pieces like the bishops and the horses, so you can speed up the game. You also have to be careful here. You don't want to lose an important piece at mid game, like a queen or a rook or a very strong bishop in a very strong position, like a Thean shattered bishop. We'll explain what a Thean shattered bishop when we explain the king when we teach how to do the King's Indian. Then the end game. Now, depending on how was your mid game, your end game can either look like this, where you have 2 pawns, or it can look like this, where you have a decent amount of pieces. Now, end games are like where you want to make a checkmate because you're closing into the game and probably your time is running low. So here is where you want to get your pieces moving and start moving for that checkmate. What's a checkmate? A checkmate is when the king is placed in a check. This is very important. And has no legal moves left. If you look here, if you remember that queens can move diagonally and horizontally and vertically. So the king is checked and he has nowhere to go and he can't take the queen because it's protected by a king. So it's a king's queen checkmate. What happens if you don't check the queen? I mean, you don't check the king, but the king doesn't have any your opponent's king doesn't have any illegal moves left. It's called a stalemate. This is an example of a stalemate. The king isn't checked because pawns don't capture in front of them, and he can't move here or here because there's a king protecting these squares. So a stalemate is like a draw. No one wins or loses, and it's very annoying when you get them, especially when you think, oh wow, this is a checkmate, and then boom, it's a stalemate. Another way you can get a draw in chess is if you repeat the same move 3 times, you and the opponent. So you both move the pieces in the same spot 3 times in a row. So be careful with that. Special rules in chess. So we're gonna show examples of this in a chess board and an analysis board. We're gonna start with en passant. All right. Oh no. This is is bad. Alright, so we know that chess pieces, I mean pawns, can only eat diagonally, right? So that means this piece here, if black wants to like push with the pawn, they want to do that. Move 2 squares ahead. Alright? But en passant means in passing in French. So you can take his pawn. Right? Which is pretty cool. So you gotta be careful when you move, and it doesn't work when you... Let's go one move back. It doesn't work if you like, let's to move. If you do this, if it's 1 square at a time, you can't take it with en passant. En passant only like happens when he moves, when the pawn does its first move with 2 squares, and then you can take it. Another thing about en passant is, let's say you have an en passant right now, but you don't take the pawn, but you like move your bishop. This is an example. You can't take it by en passant anymore because it's supposed to happen in the same turn that you have the opportunity to do it. So it has to happen in the second, in the moment. The next thing is promotion. This is an example of promotion. So what happens if a pawn, which starts from here, moves all the way to the other side of the board? Does it like just come back? No. It promotes to any piece. Now, it's important to know that you can have as many pieces, as many queens as you want. You can have more than 1 queen in the board, so you don't have to like worry about having more than 1 queen. You can have 8 queens because you have 8 pawns. If you don't lose any of the pawns, of course. Yeah. I think this is checkmate. Anyways, sorry, I got distracted. You can. It doesn't also have to be a queen. It can be any piece you want, as long as it's not another pawn. It can be a horse. Maybe a rook. It can be a bishop. But usually you'd want it to be a queen, because queens are the best piece. Only if you think you can do better with a horse, then you're pretty cool. Our last thing, the last special rule that in chess is castling. Now, castling has a few rules. So what castling really is we can't castle now because there's a horse here. Now we're gonna move our horse, waste a move with the black king, and then see that? If I do this, the king is castled. It's protected. This is the only time in chess where you're allowed to move 2 pieces at once. It won't work if, you know, as you can see, it won't work if, you know, let's like waste a move. It won't work if there's like something like protecting this lane, protecting the lane that you want to castle to. So see now, I can castle here. I wasn't able to castle here before because there's a queen protecting this lane. So, wait. So I can't castle this side. Also, another thing that I gotta be careful of is that if like let's say this piece moves, and then you switch another move, and then moves back to the spot, then switch another move here. You still can't castle with it. So if you move your rook or king, also counts for the king. So let's say if your king moved, and then like, then let's move him back here. Then he's moved back here. Another ways to move. You can't castle with the king anymore. And it also applies to your rook. If your rook moved, you can't castle anymore. There's also another thing that might happen. Alright, so let's say you want to castle. Alright, let's move the horse here. If the king is checked, you can't castle. You have to like get out of the way. So the three scenarios where you're not allowed to castle is if a piece is protecting a lane that's in between you and your rook, or if there's a piece in between you and the rook. By you I mean the king, or if the king is checked. So these are the three rules in chess. Now I'm gonna teach you the King's Indian opening. So we understood what's an opening by the opening phase slide. So the King's Indian it's an opening that doesn't need a lot of theory, because it's gonna end up looking the same with most games. The only time I'll tell you the only time where you have to do something. So let's say it starts off with the horse, because remember when I told you horses can jump over pieces? Yeah, that's what I meant. Then let's let them do the same thing. Then you move this pawn here. Now, when you move this pawn here, your opponent probably expects you to do something called a Thean shadow. You Thean shadow your bishop. It's essentially when your bishop is surrounded by 3 pawns. And then you castle your king. Because now your horse and bishop are not in the way, so you can castle your king. So now you have a very strong position and a protected king. Now, I'm gonna tell you what happens if, for example, your opponent it's not gonna go this smooth most of the time. So your opponent's gonna do something like this, and then you keep on doing your King's Indian, right? So if you keep doing it, wait, I did wrong. So you start with your King's Indian by moving your horse, and then your opponent does something like this, and then you keep doing your King's Indian. All right, now you're screwed, because he's about to move his pawn here, and thus he'll threaten your horse. So how do you counter that? And if you lose your horse, that's a losing. That's a very bad trade. So when that happens, you gotta push your pawn to d3, and thus, if the pawn does move down here, so let's say he actually does do it, you can take it with your pawn, but he probably isn't gonna do it because he doesn't want to lose a pawn. He doesn't want to be down by a pawn, or she doesn't want to be down by a pawn. So this is the only time you have to do something about it. And if that's here, you're pretty good for the rest of the opening. He'll just let's say he moves a bishop here, and yeah, you have a King's Indian. You only move this pawn if he moves the queen pawn 1 square, and then he moves the king pawn 2 squares, because he's gonna threaten your horse. And what's cool about Thean shadowed bishops is that they can threaten the rook. So if they move this pawn, and you remove this horse somewhere like here, you can take the rook. And if he doesn't, if you didn't activate these pieces yet, that's a free rook. You can go back to your spot. So this is chess in a nutshell. This is the end. Thank you for bearing with us. I hope this tutorial sparked your curiosity in chess. There's a lot more openings and tactics in chess that you can learn, more than you were taught in this tutorial. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.